Hi, thanks. And thanks again to Helmut and Uli to inviting me to do this, because you don't get the chance to talk to somebody like Yat any day, every day, especially not in a fireside chat. So Yat, I'm very glad to see you here again. We had a brief talk before, and you have something that they in America call, I think, what a life. You were born in Vienna. You were born into a very musical family. Your mother was a conductor, as I understand. Your father was a cellist. Is that right? Did I get that right? And you yourself?
Actually violin. And
a violin.
Mom was an opera singer.
Just a small.
Anyway,
but you studied cello, right?
I studied cello. Yes.
You studied cello, and so you started in a quite different world than you're operating in now. But you started with programming musical software. And then in 1996, you moved to Hong Kong and started Cyber City, that later became Free Nation. And somebody said it was Asia's first free web page and email provider. Is that right?
That's probably correct. Yeah. And first ISPs as well. Yeah.
Okay, so you started pioneering quite young, and then in 2014 you became the co-founder. You were the co-founder or the founder of Animoca. It's a company that we will probably talk a bit later about a little bit later, because it is a company that is already conquering many things that a lot of people are just starting to be aware about now. I think we could talk the whole half hour about what your company does, because it's a lot. First and foremost, you're a game software company, and I looked at your portfolio, and at my age, you know a few of these things from the smartphone screens of your kids. So like Power Ranger, Legacy Wars, or Projection First Light. I have to admit, I'm from the Pac-Man generation. But you also your company holds a lot of cryptocurrency and other holdings. And I saw that you're involved in some of the really cutting edge places of right now, like OpenSea. OpenSea was one of the pioneering places where you could trade with NFTs, and some of the big names in NFT art are trading there. And then also what I really liked is that you're involved in Colossal Biosciences. That's a fantastic company. There's this genius geneticist, George Church, and he is maybe one of the greatest natural science minds of these days. And he's going to resurrect the woolly mammoth, the Tasmanian tiger, and the dodo with this company. This could be a whole different fireside chat, and this is by no way a metaphor about what we're going to talk about now, because we're going to not talk about the far past, but the far future. And who better to talk to than you, because you already live there, and it's a future that many regular citizens, and my job as a journalist is always to try to convey what's going on out there in the future to general readers who are not involved in this every day. I mean, most of you who are here tonight probably deal with these topics professionally as well. But for most people, it's still what Chancellor Merkel once called Neuland, uncharted territory. But just to like get so that we are all on the same page, let's start with defining the metaverse, because there's so many definitions about the metaverse around these days. So let's settle for your definition, because we're talking to you tonight.
Great. No, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. So, the way that we would define the metaverse, and that's really the mission of Animoca Brands, is delivering and for all of us to basically have true digital property rights. So when we think of the evolution of the web, so where I started off with, I guess what we now call Web 1, but back then was just the internet. It was really the web of information. So it was read. And actually the revolution that took place in Web 1 was that we all actually had a democratized access of the same information. So knowledge basically became quasi-democratized, and it allowed people to trade on that information on more equal grounds. Simple example, if I was a farmer in China, I could now know what my rice was sold for in America. And then I could say, oh, actually you were selling it for 99% more than I was making. So that's one. So the arbitrage would change. But also it allowed basically people to sort of third parties to come in and actually say, oh, actually, I can sell your rice for you in America. I only need a 30% cut, for instance, and value would transfer. And that's what happened basically in Web 1. And then in Web 2, what's commonly known as read-write, right, which is basically the social web. Basically, we started to add to the composer of the web. So information was something that we generated as users, whether this is YouTube and videos, or whether this is Wikipedia, or whether this is forums, Reddit. And actually everything we do on Instagram and Facebook, it's actually Web 2 because we add content to it. And so we created the fabric of this information. Whether it's right or wrong is a different question, but we basically started creating content. And because content became so difficult to analyze, we needed basically central platforms to organize it for us. We had information overload. And that basically was the role of the platform. So you had basically Facebook, and you had Amazon, and you had Google, right? Google was basically indexing the world, making sense of all this information that we couldn't make sense of anymore because we no longer had a single source of truth, right? Like when I grew up in, so I'm dating myself, but in the 80s we used to read the newspaper. That was our source of truth, right? And then now when the information came out, with Google was the source of truth, but all the information we couldn't organize. So they would tell you through an algorithm what we think is truth because it's based on basically whoever sort of read it most, for instance, or whatever the social users would say. That actually then started to get weaponized. I'll get to that part because this is where Web 3 becomes important. Web 3, and which is what we define as a metaverse, is essentially read, write, and own, right? Which means that now we're able to own a part of this new internet. Now, what does that mean? So it means
just a quick question to understand. So in the Web 2, we didn't really own. We produced information, but we didn't really own it.
That's right. So we produced information, and just to clarify, we produced data. So this information is both direct and indirect. What I mean is direct information is stuff I type in and I give and photos. Indirect is things I do. For instance, where I go, where I travel, my movement, my patterns. Right? And actually what happens is that because of the power of basically deep learning, AI, and basically the CPU and Moore's law, the machinery was now able to make sense of that data in ever more powerful ways. In other words, data became the most valuable resource on Earth. And the mental model I sometimes think of, it's like oil. If we discovered oil 1,000 years ago in our backyard, it's not worth much because we didn't have the technology to extract value from it. But if you discovered oil in your backyard, certainly 30, 40 years ago, or even today, you would basically make a lot of money for the good fortune of having oil because you can now sell it to someone who has the machinery that can basically turn it into energy, use it in cars and all that kind of stuff. This moment happened around 2006, 2007 with data, basically with and deep learning. So we should think of ourselves as net producers of data in Web 2, and we give power essentially for the platform. So in other words,
it's a very uneven exchange. No, I mean, we do get services and digital comforts, but that's not much compared to what big corporations like Meta, Google, or I mean, Amazon is a different thing, but even Apple.
Same thing though. It's the same thing though. Every company, doesn't matter if it's Apple. So even Tesla, right? Tesla does not make self-driving cars if we don't drive their cars, right? And so, and the kind of patterns and knowledge that Amazon knows about our shopping behavior comes because we shop, obviously, and we do certain things, and it learns about us en masse, and is now able to sell us things better than we could do before. Except we are the source of that information. We are the source that makes Amazon or Facebook or Google or Tesla or any technology company or any gaming company more rich and powerful. So the question then becomes, why don't we actually get paid for us who make the service valuable? And that's basically what Web3 does, because the paradigm is who owns the data. Now in Web2, the data is owned by a centralized platform like a Google or a Facebook, and they control that data. By the way, that also means they control your existence. So for instance, you might have 1 million followers on Facebook, on Instagram. Well, who decides whether that is your Instagram in the future? Not you, right?
Well, as we just saw, isn't Twitter kind of a wake-up moment? What Web 2.0 can turn into? Because, you know, I mean,
Well,
suddenly people were thrown off and then they were let in and they were
it is,
off
but
again.
it is a wake-up moment. But you know, the wake-up moment, you know, it's not just that, you know, regardless of the controversy that a president of a country can be knocked off a social network and censored. It's actually what Facebook has done many times already in terms of removing news articles or de-emphasizing news discovery on things that basically they don't like. Or what happened in Australia when Australia was trying to tax basically, you know, Australian news media that was giving value to Facebook. What they did was they simply removed all Australian news media for a little while. I mean, you know,
that was
incredible.
pure mean bully tactics.
Well,
on the other hand,
yes.
on the other hand, they're under pressure because they do have to remove. I mean, take a country like Myanmar, where they had extreme hatred on their platform. They had to remove it to stop the violence in a country that they didn't really understand. I mean, so it's a kind of a catch-22. Can you even get out of this?
While it is a catch-22 in some ways, the issue is who gets to decide that, right? And so the point is a central platform that we did not elect, that we do not vote, that doesn't represent us, gets to basically decide it because we are basically sort of dependent on a platform. Now think of it in different ways. If we are removed from these platforms, what does it mean to us as individuals? Well, we make less friends, we have less ability to do business, we won't get discovered. Actually, if you are a news agency and you were removed from the platforms, you have no business at all, right? In other words, you become deplatformed and you remove your rights are removed from you. If you are an app developer, it is not you who gets to decide how your app is out there. It is Apple who decides, and it's Apple who can decide to take your app away on any terms they like, because it's a terms of service. It's not a kind of law or digital system. So this is the issue we have at the moment. And so we have no ownership, we're dependents, and we describe it as a kind of digital colonialism because we're really only working for them. Every time we use Instagram, we make Instagram valuable. We don't make ourselves that valuable. Sure, we borrow the platform, but the platform can remove you, as we have seen many, many times. So the point about the metaverse, I would argue that the metaverse already started 40 years ago when we went on CompuServe, because the feelings and the online experiences that we have are virtual, are real to us. You know, like when I talk to someone online, I could actually fall in love with that person. I can have feelings for that person. I can have feelings to an NPC, as the same way that we sometimes, you know, have a crush on a celebrity we've never met in real life, right? As humans, we have that capacity to do that, and so it's real to us. I
think I haven't thought about CompuServe in a very long time. I used to live in the US back then, but I think in Europe something like American Online or T Online would be comparable. So these were like these gateways to the internet for regular consumers.
That's right. So we were already having a digital existence, and so we already became quasi sort of, you know, making friendships, and it was real to us. It sort of started that journey. But where we are today is actually quite dystopian, relatively speaking, in the sense that we are online, you know, almost 10 hours a day on average, right? Which means that our mental mindset is basically already online. It's very much dependent on that. And you know, what's the first thing you do in the morning, for instance? What's probably the last thing you do before you go to bed, right? It's probably likely something virtual, as in looking at your phone or so on. And yet, actually, you know, you have no control over it really in terms of sort of the data paradigm. And so the metaverse to us has already kind of been there, but now we're moving from a feudal sort of digital environment to one where we have ownership, which then as a principle means that when we can have ownership of this metaverse, then it has real meaning to us. Because at that point, you know, we own the network effect and we derive value from this. And if you have, and this is the other thing, just as we have in sort of the democratic world, as it were, property rights are actually the ultimate defender of our personal freedoms. So if we can't have digital property rights, then how can we have digital freedoms, which we don't have today?
But how do you define these property rights? I mean, what do we actually own? Yes. Because it's basically it's a dematerialized abstract place. Even, I mean, no matter what number that web has, it's not a physical place.
The network effects of the data that you end up owning, and you have then rights attached to it, because data, which was a private good, which is, you know, in the platforms like Google and Facebook, now becomes a public good, which is why blockchain is so important. because now every piece of data is not only on a public chain, meaning by a community, it can also only be decided by the community. What makes blockchains powerful is this mechanism of what's often described as consensus. So if you want to change the value, or if you want to change the distribution of Bitcoin, for instance, as a technology, you have to get the agreement of 51% of all the ones who are mining Bitcoin, which you'll never get unless there's something people really agree on, which is how generally blockchain work. So the democratic process is embedded in the technology to decide sort of, the ownership of these things. So that means essentially, if I actually own the data, I'm now able to sort of know that it's mine, which means that someone else can have the freedom to transact with that ownership in the form of an NFT. So NFTs are generally known for digital art because of the fact that people trade them, but that's not really what's special about them. What an NFT is special for is that it represents your digital ownership and thereby also your digital identity. So I would always use sort of real life models. When you think about the physical world, our physical ownership of things, where we live, what car we have, what watch we have, what clothes we wear, actually are representations of our identity. We are very specific about what we buy because we want it to represent, either aspirationally or meaningfully, something that is of who we are. And we have different identities. We dress differently for work than we might dress for a party, or we might dress to meet our friends or hang out with our family, because we have different identities. And that's already happening in the online world. Children prefer skins. If you ask them what they want for Christmas, they probably want something virtual, because to them, that is basically their identity.
So if we can own, if we do have property rights on the web, can we also make business and profit on the web now? Because
Yes.
which we didn't really, which we weren't really able to before.
So I'll give you an example of what would change, right? What would change, for instance, is, let's say, because right now the only way that you can make money in the Web 2 paradigm is if you are a creator, right? Which is fine, right? You make videos, you make content. But in the Web 3 paradigm of ownership, as you do in the real world, owning these assets allows people to interact and do business with you because of the fact that the ownership is decentralized and I don't need permission. It's permissionless, and it allows for interoperable frameworks to develop. Let me explain this in physical terms. If you think of, for instance, the fact that you own cars in a decentralized manner, the reason why the car is more valuable today is because you can use it for your family, because they can have baby seats, because they are, you can have a business like Uber, you can have a car wash company. The industry that supports the automotive industry is far, far greater than the sale of cars itself. But if the car industry was run like a Web 2 company, if I hired a driver, I would have to ask Tesla for permission. Can I hire the driver? And then Tesla might say, yes, you can hire the driver, but you have to pay me 30% what you pay the driver, because it's not your car. It's my car, right? And I give you permission to do so. If I wanted to make a baby seat, for instance, a new innovation on top of the car, which came 30 years after the creation of the Ford Model T, I would have to ask Tesla, can I make a baby seat? And he says, yeah, sure, but every time you sell the baby seat, you need to pay me 30% because you're selling it on my car, right? This actually stifles innovation. It stifles creativity. But everything we own today comes from third-party composability, which create network effects without permission. You own a phone, you don't have to talk to Apple to create a case or to make headphones or to basically make new accessories. You just have to go to the person who owns a phone and say, hey, I have something cool for your phone. Would you like to buy it? And from that, you have innovation. And from that, you have basically new opportunities. And property rights also allows for capital formation. So the fact that you can own your house is a reason why a bank can give you a loan for 30 or 40 years. If I actually can never own the house, then I can never get a loan, and I can never get a mortgage, and I can never do long-term investment because it may be taken away from me in, imagine you're doing business in a restaurant and every 6 months they change the rules, which is what happens in the Web 2 world. You can't invest.
But I mean, the Web 2.0 players are still very powerful. They're the most economically and also culturally most powerful entities in the history of mankind, probably.
Because of the data paradigm.
And I mean, Mark Zuckerberg already renamed his company Meta, which is basically like put out a claim here. So how do we prevent that the same monopolization happens in the metaverse that happened on Web 2.0?
So first of all, we think at this point the train has left the station. and it's almost impossible to take it back in. Let me explain exactly why. First of all, because of ownership, this we see with the NFT world, and what you see with OpenSea. Last year was obviously a very tough year for crypto, but despite that, we still had $22 billion worth of NFTs sold last year. Right?
On OpenSea alone.
Yeah, for an industry that's supposed to be almost dead, it's actually pretty good because it was $21 billion actually in 2021. Now, the reason why is that even though the value has gone down, the volume of transactions has actually broadly increased, as also there's been more competition overall. So it's not just one marketplace, it's actually, basically over a dozen marketplaces around the world as well. So it's actually become thriving economically. But the big factor is, of that $22 billion of NFTs, 95%, or generally 95% of value went to the owners who sold it.
And is it on OpenSea? Is it exclusively?
No, it's OpenSea did probably 70 or 60%, but the other ones did the rest, and like Magic Eden, Blur, X2Y2. But here's the important part. If I was, in the App Store, for instance, or if I was doing Meta, so Meta charges you 47% for basically working on Meta's horizon and achieve the similar value. I need to be able, at 22 billion, it's roughly $18 billion or so of value that went directly to the owners, right? I mean, that's a big number. In order to achieve the same net effect, because of the revenue share percent number, the space has to become $180 billion, right? So so the numbers, just don't add up. Why would I pay, 50% of that, as a result? Sorry, it's not 18. It's 36 to $40 billion. But the thing is that Facebook has to first generate that value in order to share that perspective. So it's like for you, why would you pay a high tax unless you get value back in return for it? And that's the point, right? So they'd have to spend a lot more than $10 billion a year to achieve this. But the industry is growing. And this is, there's a little bit of an unfair competition here as well, because when you build in an open platform, you have open network effects. So the value of an item in the open metaverse in Web3 is 30, 40 times more valuable because it has capital formation, right? Okay. Versus the value of something that is perennially rented. Everything that is rented, which is what Web2 is, cannot have capital formation, and therefore its value can't be shared in the same way. It's like trying to compare the economy of Germany versus North Korea, right? I mean, North Korea can have 10 times or 20 times the population. It doesn't matter. It will not be interesting to build in a North Korean economy because of its central control and lack of ownership.
Did you just compare Meta to North Korea?
Yes, because actually, interesting enough, the tax in North Korea is also 47.5%.
Interesting. I mean, since we're already now on the shaky ground of politics, I mean, there's always this revolutionary undertone when people talk about the metaverse and also about blockchain and about the liberating effects. What's your take on how much of a political tool this can be in the digital and also in the real world?
So first of all, one of the things that is fascinating about blockchain is that it is not apolitical. In other words, you can change the structure of blockchain to be capitalist or socialist, if you mind. But whenever you launch it, there is a consensus and therefore a political system embedded in it, which is why it's so polarizing. So when you launch a database and it's controlled as, like in Web 1, Web 2, you can make an argument that technology is neutral, right? And it has no meaning. Blockchain, the consensus mechanism, it is absolutely political. And most implementations of blockchain are capitalist liberal. So Bitcoin, for instance, is very much a Milton Friedman sort of Hayek sort of liberal economic capitalist sort of, like
I think I just lost you, or is it my line or is it your line?
I can still hear you fine. So
he's freezing, so it's on his side.
Okay. Well, we'll just wait.
Yeah, probably has to dial in again.
Till he comes back.
Yeah.
Okay. No problem. I find this all very interesting.
Yeah, I think to be so my impression is actually he's really, really visionary, and I really love it. You know, to have that kind of vision, kind of, let's say, looking into the future of what can happen. Actually, that's a very a rare gift, actually.
Yeah.
Sorry, I got disconnected.
Yeah.
I was just saying blockchain, right? I was just saying that blockchain has political sort of perspectives embedded, right? And so the thing is that because generally most blockchains give reward mechanisms in order to maintain the node, right? So for instance, how does Ethereum work? Ethereum works because now you have staking, and when you stake it, you're actually giving your computing power to maintain the health of the network, right? And then it creates a sort of, in this case, capitalist framework where it pays you an incentive to maintain the network. And who pays for the network are the people who use it, right? And that in itself is already basically a libertarian economic system embedded with it, which therefore also has value embedded in the chain. Now, this is revolutionary for one main difference. It's like Amazon Web Services, but owned by every person who uses Amazon.
How do you?
Now, just one other thing. The one thing that makes it revolutionary is that Ethereum, as an example, is a banking grade network that can now be utilized by any person in the world, essentially for just the cost of gas. Now, the criticism that people have on blockchain is, oh, but it costs $1 per transaction. That is so expensive. Because, you know, when I use Amazon, it costs very little, right? Or when I use Facebook, apparently it costs nothing because Facebook pays for it. So that's the mental model people have. But the other way to look at it is, because every person pays $1 to this database network to keep it alive, it's the reason that a small 3-person organization or 5-person organization can now build on a database that has the capacity and security of Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs. If you want to build a banking grade system, you need to spend $1 billion and you need to hire the best engineers in the world to do it, right? So that means, look at Facebook. In order for Facebook to compete with Ethereum, it needs to have a framework where every user is prepared to pay essentially $1 per transaction or 10 cents per transaction or whatever that is, which they can't do. But now, why would a user be willing to pay 10 cents per transaction or $1 per transaction? Because they get more value back. And so we think of it like tax. You're okay to live in Germany and pay your tax, because even though it's more tax than somewhere else, you get better services and you can sell it for more. Your house is more valuable. You can make a car, you can have innovation. I don't mind paying my tax because I have services and quality of life, and I can make more money. And that's true for Ethereum. I can make more money on Ethereum selling NFTs because I can sell something for $100. I don't care if I spend $5 or $10. It matters though, if you can make only $1 and you have to pay, you know, $2, of course that's unsustainable. And that's basically why blockchains are so powerful, because essentially they've taken these difficult database moats that were only accessible for the top companies in the world and made it open to everyone, which is why a kid can actually build a sort of financial innovation, which is of course threatening in other ways. And also, unfortunately, can also be weaponized in other ways as well. So there is an element around that that one has to think about. When you imagine if JP Morgan opens up their banking infrastructure to the world and says, go ahead, innovate. Right?
I just wanted to, I mean, there's a few things that are lurking here on the horizon that worry me a little bit. For example, I mean, how do you prevent mob rule? I mean, mob rule was one of the deciding factors that turned the Web 2.0 in such an ugly place.
Well, okay, so first of all, it depends on how you design your consensus. So some blockchains basically require 2/3 or even for major decisions, like with Ethereum, if you want to do a blockchain, you need 2/3 of sort of voting majority to, which is effectively a way in which you protect minority rights, right? And you can, and that's how you design the blockchain. So that's to say that we think of a blockchain or a metaverse on chain, basically like a nation. And so similarly to that, you will have different mechanisms of consensus built around that, and the users can then decide what they prefer. It's kind of like deciding which country you want to live in.
How do you vote then? If you're an Ethereum user, I don't know.
You vote with your token. You vote with your token.
You vote with your token? How do you do that?
Well, what you do is if there's a proposal, but usually an EIP, what they call Ethereum Improvement Proposal, or what we do with ApeCoin and AIP, you then, the proposal community makes a proposal and then lobbies for it. And then if you want to make a change, like the biggest change was when Ethereum went from proof of work to proof of stake. Now, this is a monumental shift. The ones who were mining, did not like it, of course, because they would lose their source of income. But what's really interesting is that they were not unable to stop it, because more people owned Ethereum who were not miners and basically voted to basically make Ethereum effectively more green. Right? Now, this transition is fascinating because it was more smooth than Y2K, and I guess I'm old enough, and so for those to remember in terms of its transition, but was entirely done through community consensus. Right? So the normal thinking would be there is no way that you can make a big technological shift without sort of, one strong leader or one strong organization shifting it. And that completely in blockchain basically proved wrong effectively, because you could make monumental decisions that had major network impacts so long that the network is appropriately decentralized. And so when a network,
right? You just mentioned that this move or this shift made Ethereum more green, which is another thing that a lot of people criticize about blockchain and about crypto, that it uses so much energy that if this scales exponentially, we're gonna just run out of energy, period. So what changed there?
Okay, so first of all, generally speaking, we have to take a look at the perspectives of technology, right? So if we mapped out the number of cars that the world was going to have, but based on the technology of cars 100 years ago, we should all be dead, based on emissions, okay? Right. However, of course, technology improves. And one of the things that improved and changed was we went from proof of work, which is basically using your GPU that uses energy to defend the network, right? Which is basically the work element, creating a computational algorithm, to basically proof of stake. And by the way, proof of stake has its weaknesses, which I can describe quickly afterwards. And proof of stake is no longer as algorithmically computationally heavy, because I'm not using the GPU basically to solve a hash. I'm literally saying, I have a vote, I'm here. So basically, I'm like, it's like one token, one vote. The criticism on one token, on sort of that kind of proof algorithm, though, is what happens if someone has a lot of tokens? Then does that mean that they control the network, and therefore are they a majority of this? So if the network is suitably decentralized, though, and everyone has roughly a similar number of tokens, then nobody has a majority over the other. Then we have essentially a more well-functioning democratic setup. So Ethereum probably would not have been able to be proof of stake 5 years ago if they went for a vote, because the miners were controlling the network. When the community grew, when the utility expanded, it was the right time to do it. So it wasn't just a case of, well, why didn't you change to proof of stake? The people who owned or essentially were in control of Ethereum at the time, the prospectors and industrialists of their time, shall we say, basically didn't want that. They wanted to continue to run the trains and have the coal factories, right? So now that's developed and changed as a result. Yeah.
So you're based in Hong Kong, and it seems a lot of innovation does come out of Asian nations. Why is Europe, let's say, missing the boat again? Because there's a lot of hesitation, there's a lot of criticism, there's a lot of slow movement.
So let me put sort of particularly with Web3 and blockchain, because it has a strong capitalist and liberal and especially free markets perspective, the countries that embrace them more are the ones who typically succeed in this, because it has to do with the mindset, not just of the regulator, but of the people as well. So for instance, what are the countries in Europe that are actually leading in blockchain? Well, let's, for the time being, let's imagine that UK is part of Europe. I guess it kind of is, right? Depends what you say, right? But
we still feel it is.
Yeah, exactly, right? UK being one. The other one is Switzerland, right? Okay. So Switzerland is one of the leaders in this space. And what do they have in common? Very strong capitalist free market economic beliefs. Right. Now, and in Asia, for instance, even though we don't necessarily have as developed economies, we have basically places that are very, very pro-capitalist, particularly because economically the market itself hasn't actually been, the market itself has benefited from capitalism and is new, right? So meaning even places like South Korea, for instance, which is a power nation today, 40 years ago was a military dictatorship, right? There was no democracy and no property rights. And so even though there's inequity, people believe in capitalism. And so, I typically sort of say this often, that the American dream is alive and well in Asia, much more so than in America. Now, in Europe, I think the biggest issue is that generally European regulators has a different perspective on capitalism and takes the assumption that free markets aren't actually necessarily as positive a thing, meaning that we have to protect people from the bad actors. So it takes more of a negative perspective. It basically means and especially the perspective of, if you're making money, then actually maybe that's also suspicious in and of itself, and we have to control that, which basically gives essentially a negative slant towards it, which, by the way, is also one of the reasons why in the West, particularly in Europe, for instance, there is a bigger crypto movement, because there's generally an anti-capitalist movement. So crypto represents, when you think of Bitcoin, for instance, digital capitalism. And so if you already don't like physical capitalism, you effectively don't like digital capitalism, which is really what this represents. And so you have that, and it's more pronounced amongst youth, because capitalism doesn't work for youth. So for instance, America, 10 years ago, this idea that you could have a potentially socialist leader, have a run at the presidential election would have been unimaginable maybe 10 years ago. And now you have Bernie Sanders, and the Democratic Party basically makes it a platform, because most people under the age of 30 actually think capitalism is broken for them, and not surprisingly so, right? And obviously, that's also because capital has appreciated tremendously and labor basically has stayed broadly flat. And this is a global problem here, which we think Web3 will solve, because the new labor is our data. So from that perspective, we think we will be able to sort of get more shares in what we do in a new kind of capitalism. But that is the part that needs to be better understood. And I think Europe, unfortunately, for the regulatory side, needs to have an appreciation for this, which I think is harder. And that's why Asia is actually, for the time being, leading. Like Hong Kong, Japan, even Korea, they have positive policies in blockchain and crypto. And what we know from discussions with the regulators, they're much more cautious in Europe.
But before we switch over to the Q&A, make me understand why as I'm not a young person anymore, but there's young persons here in the house. Why these people downstairs should be excited about blockchain in a climate where their future does not guarantee that they'll be better off than their parents anymore, since probably already 1 or 2 generations.
So the first thing I would say is that the future isn't brighter for them in the world as is, right? Meaning that it is not possible for the younger generation to compete with the older generation in terms of asset ownership, in terms of jobs, whatsoever, right? I mean, I live in Hong Kong. It is impossible for someone who graduates, at the top university to ever own a home in Hong Kong. Just no chance. And I think this is true for most of California. It's certainly true for New York. It's true for London, right?
Munich.
I mean, yeah, Munich, right? I mean, remember, what was the cost of a house 30 years ago or 40 years ago? Also, with, in my parents' generation, when they deposited money, they could actually make 8% interest, right? The last 20, 30 years of basically zero interest and free money has completely altered the landscape and made that really difficult. So capital owning class basically ended up just appreciating in value. And the other thing is, of course, the other consequence is the lack of financial education. So when people may graduate from college, they have no idea about how to invest. They have no idea about sort of risk. They don't understand financial allocations, none of that type of stuff. And so they basically missed out on this. And I think the other thing is, of course, because we were really, the economies and the companies were really sort of pushing for shareholder capitalism, which generally benefits a small cohort of people, versus basically a more kind of stakeholder capitalist approach where somehow you can share the value across. Now, why is it better for youth? Well, outside of the fact that the paradigm changes from what was a customer consumer to a customer owner. So for instance, if I buy land in Sandbox, I'm a customer, but I'm also an owner in Sandbox, which means that if...
Could we just, for everybody here, explain Sandbox?
So Sandbox is a metaverse.
Or exactly, let's. I mean, we all seen what Mark Zuckerberg tried to sell us as the metaverse, and what is the difference here to Sandbox?
Okay, so, and there's different metaverses, but in the case of Sandbox, it's kind of like a Minecraft-like world. Everything, all the land you own is yours, just like you own in the physical world. You have the freedom to transact, you can sell it, and you can build on top of it. You have network effects already because you can build next to Paris Hilton or Snoop Dogg. You know, Gucci has a shop there. You know, Nike has an experience there. Like all the big brands have built on it. And basically, you can, you know, sell virtual items to the community that is there. Now, that may seem a little awkward if you're not in that world, but if you're already spending 10 hours in the virtual world, and if you're already sort of coveting these digital assets, these forms of digital culture, then actually that's not that crazy because that's your identity. Sandbox, as an example, is now a digital world. You could say like almost like, you know, if you remember Second Life, kind of similar to that, but it has a daily economic volume of approximately $200 million a day, right? And there's 250,000 people who use Sandbox, but the 250,000 people are not 250,000 sort of players in the classic sense. You can think of them almost like citizens. That's why the economy of Sandbox is so large, because it's like having imagine a town with 200,000 people that have trade, that build things, that create experiences, and then they do business with each other. You know, it's going to be worth a lot more than just something where I'm just playing games, right? And
can I actually turn the value from Sandbox into fiat money?
Yes, you can. Because, and this is the innovation on blockchain, and also this is why it's so capitalist, you could say, because I can now take that value and I can convert it into fiat in an exchange. So I can go to Coinbase, take my asset that I sold for Sand tokens and turn it into US dollars and take it out. However, and this is the thing that's so different, is that majority do not take it out. They don't take it to fiat. They keep it in crypto, and they may not keep it in, you know, a volatile crypto, but they keep it in a stable crypto like USDC, which is Circle, which is a US dollar denominated crypto. You know, one of the reasons why, you know, in 2017, 2018, when the crypto market really collapsed, right, like terribly, actually what happened was there was a flight to fiat. So everyone sold their Bitcoin and everyone sold their crypto into fiat. And so there was, you know, that's why it dropped so much. Yeah. But because also there's no utility. The only reason to have crypto in 2018 was to speculate. That's it. But now, because you have use cases, because you're using it to buy NFTs or skins or forms of culture or activity or make business, you keep it as crypto. So the flight wasn't into fiat in the classic sense. The flight was to stablecoins. So if you look at what happened when FTX happened, for instance, people took their money out, but actually they converted into stablecoins. So it's still crypto, but it's US dollar crypto. And so the reserves of USDC and USDT just exploded while the other tokens fell, but actually it was still in crypto. And then at the start of the year, when people were feeling ready to really engage, the shift happened really fast because they didn't have to move fiat back into the world of crypto. It was already in crypto. So the conversion basically instant. So that's basically sort of, and the form of transaction, this is key. I can now do this in a trustless manner. If it's in crypto, I can now create a transaction system with you and trade the item and get money without using a bank. I don't need to send a wire transfer. I don't need an intermediary. The blockchain takes care of that. And that's actually the other thing that's really powerful.
But how can I defend myself against these volatile market movements in the crypto world? I mean,
well, you don't have to defend yourself because you don't have to sell it you don't have to sell it in Ethereum if you don't want the volatility. You can sell it in USDC. Okay. You can sell it in US dollars. It's just US dollar crypto, but you can sell it in USDC. So, and a lot of people do that. They just sell it in USDC because they have to pay the salaries in USDC and that kind of stuff. Just to close on the topic on the kids, the digital world is, you know, we think of ourselves as digital immigrants. I think most of us probably were born in the 80s or 70s, certainly, or maybe even early 90s. We're digital immigrants. We entered that world, but we're not from that world. Our children are absolutely digital natives. So this is their world. They understand it, right? They can do things online that we can just, you know, marvel, right? They can play games 10 times better than we can. So this is their environment, right? So what we haven't allowed them to do is for them to own it. And that to me is the paradigm shift. Now, what happens when you have ownership? The example that we think of is very similar to what happens in the physical world. If a country goes from no property rights to property rights, the GDP and the economic activity, it basically sort of absolutely accelerates. And I think this was sort of analyzed in sort of this award-winning book by actually, unfortunate name of Hernando Cortés, no relationship to the conquistador, who's a Peruvian, I think he's Peruvian economist. And he basically analyzed that, you know, anytime a sort of undeveloped country basically enacted property rights and defended those property rights, GDP went up and value went up and income went up. And so the Web 2 world, which is already trillions of dollars in value, is essentially no property rights. When we actually take that and to give them property rights, we have economic growth and activity that isn't, you know, 10% or 20%, but is literally 30 to 50x, as we've seen in the physical world, which is the reason why NFTs are so valuable in comparison to their non-equivalent sort of, you know, rental object. And the reason we had started with gaming is already a $200 billion industry. $100 billion is spent on rental goods, effectively. What happens when you take that and turn them into actual sort of property rights? It also allows people to compose on top of those experiences, which is why we think, you know, just the gaming business alone will turn into a multi-trillion-dollar business. McKinsey, you know, had an analysis. I think they said in 2030, they said the metaverse will be $5 trillion. Who knows? But I think everyone agrees that the metaverse opportunity, and particularly the ownership of things, will have an incredible value creation, which is the opportunity, not just for us, but for the younger generation to participate, because they can't do that in Munich or in Hong Kong or in London.
All right, let me call my kids. Next question actually would be for Helmut. Could we have another hour, or do you want to open the mic to Q&A?
Oh, well, I think since we just have 7 minutes left, I think we should open up for very urgent questions, if there are. I mean, I have some as well of myself. So, Tum, would you like to go?
Yeah, thank you, Helmut. Nice to meet you yet. We met a couple of years ago. And my question is actually, I believe in, let's say, the function on theory of blockchain, also of smart contracts. But what I'm worried about is actually with all the scandals that are happening with FTX, Luna, blah, blah, blah. And they are kind of endangering, or let's say, the system, because every scandal is another add-on on losing trust. How do you see that? Especially, for example, I'm not sure how true that is, but you sometimes hear lately that, you know, Binance is also kind of, you know, be like an unstable factor. Another thing maybe I should add is, so I come from a gaming world. So for example, I ran a company that had 400 million monthly active users, a company called Spill Games. So I know, let's say, how to deal with large capacity numbers, you know. But when I look at Sandbox, for example, they are so much smaller, and also the experience is not yet there where it should be, right? And I also there, for example, you know, looking at sort of how unstable, for example, the technology is, you know, I was wondering, or I'm actually hoping, you know, that they are able to fix it, to bring it to the level where it holds maybe a capacity of 100 million concurrent users, for example. But where I see the challenge right now is happening, and what are the threats that you see actually? Sure. And how can you kind of find ways, let's say, in a system perspective, on how to prevent that happening? Because that would, you know, if major scandals would happen, or, you know, people or companies are failing, that would be my concern actually for the system or for this ecosystem, that people are losing trust in that.
Right. So many questions. So let me sort of, I guess, address them.
Sorry for that.
No, that's good. It's good. So we address them sort of, you know, bit by bit. So first question relates to basically fraud. So first of all, if you actually consider what happened with FTX, it's outright fraud. And the mechanisms of protection on this one is, if everything was actually decentralized and on-chain, this stuff wouldn't have happened. This is the irony. Everything that was decentralized and on DeFi did exactly as functioned, because the proof of reserves, the chain activity would have immediately alerted everyone that there's a problem. But FTX was a closed system. Yeah, Sam said the right things, but he didn't do it because he basically played on the ignorance of the market. So this regulation will fix. One thing to say about regulation is good. And the introduction of regulation and the hesitance of regulation from regulators in the past was endorsement. When you regulate, you say it's real. Right? You can't regulate something that is basically not supposed to be here. right? It's not worth it, right? You can ban it, but if you don't want to ban it, then you don't regulate it. This is a dichotomy that places like India find themselves. They want to tax crypto, but they say it's not real. So what is it, please, right? And so what FTX has demonstrated is that it is systemic enough that you must regulate it. By regulating it, you create a safe framework. And what you also do is you're saying it's here for good. It's something. And the paradigm shift 2 years ago or 2.5 years ago, a lot of regulators were like, I don't believe in blockchain. I think crypto is sort of, not real. So, let it just go away. And, we just don't endorse it. Now, the general consensus is it's here to stay and we have to do something. So that to me is a positive. The second thing is that means things like these, what's happening in these exchanges, like if you look at, for instance, yes, FTX was a complete fraud. However, Coinbase, Kraken, Gemini, at the end of the day, the pure exchange businesses, they work just fine because they're regulated, and they basically have to do what other exchanges have to do. So there is a framework, but most people, if they deal in decentralized systems, will be okay. Because but most people don't keep assets in the self-custody way because they've lost how to do it because the platforms used to always do it for them. So they have to re-educate themselves a little bit for that. So that's one. Two, in terms of the question of scalability. So blockchain, now especially with sharding and so on, is getting faster, but it's still not at the level where it needs to be. I think of it. The example I sometimes think of it is a little bit like database systems 30 years ago. Right? You can't have a big multiplayer game, 30 years ago. So you have limitations around it, but the technology will quickly catch up. But the innovation of blockchain, as I said maybe earlier, isn't the fact that it is a technology. It's actually a political system embedded in the technology. In other words, what is the innovation? Is that the decisions and changes in the database can only happen with the consensus of the community itself. And that comes to the next point, which is a community does not need to be 100 million users to be valuable. In Web 2, because you only make money through advertising or through very, very small microtransactions, the value of a user is 1 cent, 10 cent, $1, something small like that. But in real aspects, actually, you are not worth $1. You're worth $100, $50, $1,000. And that's basically possible in an actual economic framework, which is why even a game controversially like Axie Infinity, with only a few 100,000 active users, can still be $100 million game, which in a traditional game is impossible. But you can't have such a big game with that because you don't have property rights embedded. We have two examples in the classic gaming world that have demonstrated that: EVE Online and Second Life. Second Life is over 20 years old. EVE Online, roughly the same, right? EVE Online is a $400 million sort of economic sort of sized game. Second Life last year was $620 million. Now, for a game that's that old, you kind of go, wow, most people don't hear about it. What's the population of Second Life? Less than 1 million. Less than 1 million, right? So what we think will happen is that there's going to be thousands and thousands of games, and we think it's going to be sort of this renaissance of indie game developers, because you can now make a game for 10, 20, 100,000 people that are sort of niche, but actually really great experiences because real value is being transferred and it's sustainable, as opposed to you must have 10 million users to even make a profit. And that to me, I think of it often in parallels like the restaurant business, right? You can have a great restaurant that's Michelin star, but only serve 1,000 customers, and that's fine, right? Well, it doesn't have to be a big business, but it's something that we can be sustainable. But right now, the gaming world and the digital world is like everyone has to eat McDonald's, right? We all have to have mass scale the same stuff in order to scale it out. And that's why we have a lack of this diversity and choices out there. But in time, the technology will also get better, as is already happening, right? And so that means in, I think, a few years, you'll get to what you want, which is basically faster on-chain sort of mechanisms. Most of blockchain is used today for games to prove your ownership. It's not actually used for on-chain mechanic, but you can imagine when the data structure is fast enough, which is happening very quickly, then if everything is on-chain, then actually you can see how people can compose new experiences based on the battle. So for instance, let's say I play World of Warcraft, for instance, and we're having a fight, and now the fight is on-chain, so I can always know the true output of who's the winner, who's the loser. People outside of World of Warcraft can design systems basically that would create data sets, or maybe even betting or other forms of gamified elements on top of the action that took place in World of Warcraft because it was on-chain, right? And And these data structures will get fast enough to do that, which to me is incredibly exciting, but of course is very disruptive.
So if I may ask, because I know the, let's say, the relation in numbers, but do you see actually, for example, a game in the blockchain space that has the potential to enter and crack it like Candy Crush, especially also with more female audience, female human beings coming into the let's say into the blockchain world, because it's still kind of, you know, complicated. So the threshold is pretty high, like the technology barrier, so to say. And it reminds me a lot, you know, compared to using the internet 20 years ago, you know, when you had a dialer with a modem and was really kind of, you know, you had to be kind of a tech nerd in order to make your way into the internet if you were not using T-Online or AOL, for example.
Yes, so no, that's a great question. And the short answer is that, you know, obviously we're not at a point where we have the fastest technology for it, but many things that are available to us. For instance, we have fast GPUs, we have faster computers, we have internet, you know, we have 5G, like all these things didn't exist. So from our perspective, it's going to be faster. It's going to be faster than we think, but it's not going to happen overnight. Also, last year, I mean, this is the other important part. Roughly $12 billion was invested in Web3 games alone in 2022. Now, that is more than traditional gaming and certainly indie game developers. And we know that it takes roughly 2 to 3 years to make really good games. So you translate that backwards. And you go, okay, and this is why we believe that in the next 12 to 18 months, we're going to have a big explosion of mass adoption, because these games that are high quality, made by real studios that have this capacity, the next Candy Crush or the next sort of League of Legends or PUBG will come because the amount of money was already developed. We only hear, you know, the crypto Wall Street news around FTX failing, but those guys raised fiat, right? And they're going to make a great, awesome game. These guys used to work at Ubisoft, at Activision, at EA. They know what they're doing, and not all of them will succeed. But, you know, in our portfolio alone, we have 138 games, and you know, we're excited about all of them. But you don't need, as you know, in the gaming industry, to have all of them succeed. You just need one of them to do well, and the entire industry will grow. That's what Angry Birds did. That's what Candy Crush did, and so forth.
Thank you, Yad. We are already 5 minutes over time, and I don't want to occupy the rest of the evening for you. I mean, you're sitting in Dubai. It's already like 10 o'clock that time. So I think So thank you again very, very much for this very, very intense and insightful conversation with Andrian. And thank you, Andrian, for taking the time being the interviewer of Yad.
My
and
pleasure.
hopefully we see and read something afterwards. To me, just to close, it's really quite astounding. I mean, 12 years ago, I was part of the WEF working group of rethinking personal data. And at that time, we were already thinking about, how to create digital assets and to take ownership back. So digital feudalism, Yad called it digital colonialism, how to, avoid this situation. But it's, again, technology that provides a solution like Web3, but not regulation, at least not state created. So I would like to end the session here. Of course, not the conversation itself. And hopefully, we stay in touch. And for next time, if you would like to keep in touch with our Vision Award, next one is in May 9th. Also another evening edition after work. And finally, end of July is the Vision Award, where we acknowledge startups, early stage startups that provide products and services for a desirable future. So thank you everyone in the call and for the very intense engagement. Yad again and Andrian. So thank you very much and see you soon.
Thank you for putting this together. Great session. Liked it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.